So this time we're going to talk more in depth about the issue of identity in post-polio. And it seems to be the thing that when I say it to most polio survivors that come to see me, seems to resonate the most. Now, I say most because people who have never been able to pass as non-disabled have a different set of issues with this. And I found this out, of course, you find out a lot of things as a clinician by walking completely into a mess. And I made, the mistake of making the assumption that everybody with polio has these identity issues, because I'd had such an amazing response to talking about it. I just figured, okay, this is the golden thing. And then, of course, I hit the person who just looked at me like, that's not a problem for me at all, because I've always been in a wheelchair, and I know I'm disabled, and it isn't an issue for me. Post-polio isn't the same for me as it's going to be for somebody who could pass, and I'd never thought about it. So I'm very careful. I had said in the other session that everybody's an individual, and I try not to generalize except when I do. So there's an example. We all make mistakes, and I think it's most important, you don't hear a lot of people in my position admit to their mistakes. I think it's very important to do that, because if you're going to do a lot of this work, you're going to make a lot of them. But that being said, the issue of identity for people who could pass is really a major one. And I think in a way, there's a part of it that's an issue for all polio survivors, because the way that you were all rehabbed was to bring you back into the quote-unquote normal world. Now, there's nothing there that was both a blessing and a curse, as we know now. And the blessing was that all of you got to do things that perhaps people of the same age going through rehab now, if they acquire a disability, may very well not get the chance to do. Then again, they have more adaptive opportunities and they have more freedom in that way. So there's a balance, and they may not suffer the consequences of having been badly rehabbed and told to overextend themselves. But the whole idea that you were going to recover by hard work, hard exercise, and getting out there and just doing everything as if you were normal was a very powerful one. It was, shot through the entire culture. People were sent home from rehab on what I think of as almost the Vietnam War model for the United States, where our soldiers were sent over into a war to fight. They were sent often, usually by themselves. They spent a year with intense camaraderie. Then they were told to go home and forget it ever happened. And they were sent home alone on the plane. And they were back in a community where nobody understood their experience, and they weren't supposed to talk about it. And that's what happened to most, if not all of you, in one way or another. You were supposed to go home and have a normal life. And if you look at the books, for anybody who had it as a child, if you look at the books that were written in the 50s about this, the little that was written, actually it wasn't even books, it was a few articles, comments are made about how no normal child would be affected by the polio experience if you only just let it pass by. You should all just go home, get on with your lives. Only a very maladjusted child would have lasting psychological effects. Now, any of you have had a child in a children's hospital any time in the last 10 to 20 years, you understand that no matter what's going on with the child, you may very well be getting a visit from the child life advocate or the social worker to talk to you about how are you going to help the child with his or her issues or his or her hospitalization. And for that matter, you as a parent are expected to be at the hospital 24/7, 365. So, your child gets to be a child with a parent around. So the other piece of identity for all of you was, how do you shut off the part of yourself that needs and wants care when you're not being given it? When every time you look for care, you might be shut down. There are stories of people being abused for looking for affection. There's a book called Passage Through Crisis, which is very, very interesting. It was a sociological study, and I'm blanking on the author's name, but if you look it up, it's very famous. And it follows a group of boys in Baltimore in a rehab home. And the boys wrote what was called the good list. And the good list was basically the internalization of the enemy. So they wrote down things like little people should be seen and not heard, and following the rules, and all these other things. And of course, I've heard stories from rehab homes, and I think there were other things going on there as well as that. You know, there was a lot of kart racing and things going on for some people too. But the consequences of having to alter your identity in all these ways, of having to be this perfect little person, this perfect little patient who swallows all their pain. If any of you were at Gail Kennedy's talk yesterday, she talked about the most radical form of that, of having to divide herself in two, where she was Aborigine when she went home and used her never used first name when she went to the rehab. And this is not an uncommon experience in one regard or another for people who had polio at an early age. There's also consequences with attachment. For those of you who were separated for long periods, or were separated in certain age groups, especially the 2 to 4s, those are ages when you're 2. If you think about your toddler desperately wants to get away from you, except she doesn't. So, you know, the toddler is, no, pick me up, no, out the arms, wants it and doesn't want it. Now, the 2-year-old who gets taken away because of their polio gets their separation wish. But they've been very naughty because they've been taken away. And that's how a 2-year-old's mind operates on it. I did something wrong and I got my wish, and it wasn't really my wish because I also wanted to be held. And there's long-term consequences for that, for who you are. So many people find that they do have trouble with attachment, and they're more disconnected from their relationships than they want to be. And dealing with that as an adult is very difficult. And everybody in this room was probably going along just fine after they went home in one way or another, because, you know, the capacity for resilience is great. But then post-polio came along. And post-polio is where the identity issues get stirred up, because all of these things that you did to get on with your lives, now they're not going to work for you because now you have post-polio, and the post-polio person experiences themselves as having been sold a bill of goods about polio. They did all the right things, and yet now they're weak. And they can't do the things that they used to do to get stronger again. And what I often see at the clinic are people who are desperately trying to exercise to get back into shape. I have one woman who was riding her bicycle, her stationary bicycle, 5 days a week for 30 minutes. Actually, it turned out she was riding it 7 days a week for 30 minutes. She didn't want to admit to that. And she was told she shouldn't be doing that. So she decided that 3 days a week would be a good idea. But, you know, she believed if she stopped, she wasn't going to be her. And the degree to which she values herself as an active person with agency in the world is very, very important and very key. But it's this fine balance of how do you become the new person who needs to conserve to preserve, and how do you continue to do the things that give your life light and color? In the earlier talk I was talking about, you know, the fellow that we heard about yesterday who might perhaps want to continue to go bushwalking. And I think it would be important to find a way to continue to go bushwalking, but then is it really bushwalking if you're taking your power scooter? Probably not. But how do you continue to do the things that give your life light and color? And how does it affect you to do that? You know, can you still be you if you can't ride your stationary bike 7 days a week? Can you be you if you can't ride a stationary bike at all? And can you be you if now all of a sudden, instead of being a passer, you have to deal with the fact that you're a person with a disability? And this is something that comes up all the time. I refer to it because people who were sent home from these rehabs without ever seeing another person with a disability again often suffer from internalized crypophobia, which the analog would be, you know, if you think about the person person of color, very often it has internalized prejudice against their racial makeup. The gay or lesbian person very often suffers from internalized homophobia. It's wanting the majority culture. The person with a disability who's never had to own their disability very often suffers very powerfully from internalized crypophobia. And it's not something that society recognizes. It's not something that you can go and say, oh, yes, I'm trying to come out as a person with a disability. Well, what does that really mean? You know, because we're a culture, I'm assuming it's true in Australia too, although I've gotten a lot less flack for my gray hair than I get at home. I assume it's just as youth obsessed here. And of course, disability, you know, makes people uncomfortable because it's the one minority we can all wake up tomorrow morning and find out that we've joined. It brings up associations with aging. It is a part of our identity we really don't want to embrace anyway. But everybody at some point, you know, 50% of people are going to live through a period of disability. For those of you who are moving into, through the late effects of polio, the possibility of increasing disability, you know what that's going to be, well, or you don't, because tomorrow it could be something else. But you're being confronted with identity, you're being confronted with mortality. And your existence then confronts other people with those things too. And the discomfort of that, for them, often provokes reactions in them that make you further question your identity. So there's a whole range. This is a halting speech in a way, because there's such a range of places that identity brings us. And I don't believe that I have the last word on all the places that those are. You know, you're the ones that know who you are and the ways that dealing with post-polio brings who you are into question. But I would just invite you to reflect on that in your lives and to understand that some of what you go through as people dealing with the late effects of polio and or post-polio syndrome is the revival of this sense of yourself as less than, and in a very painful, you know, in as painful a way as that can come about, and that you may very well have to deal with issues of trauma related to what happened to you. You may very well have to deal with issues of grief and loss related to what happened to you. Because when your identity comes into question, it can be a very traumatic thing, and it's definitely a grief-provoking thing. When you lose valued parts of yourself, if you lose the ability to be an athlete, if you lose the ability to care for yourself, if you lose the ability to walk, then you are dealing with a piece of your identity that has fallen away. And the grief and the loss of that is a very painful thing and a very difficult thing to have to deal with. And I'm actually going to stop here, and if anyone has any questions, or has any comments, I believe that this is the idea of identity in polio, again, it's really more about what you guys are dealing with than what I can tell you about, so I'd like to hear from you.
So if anybody's got questions,
okay.
I can use this one.
Okay.
So has anyone got any questions that they'd like to ask at this point? Thank you.
Hi, Stephanie.
Hello, Jenny.
We had a short talk yesterday. Look, what I find very difficult, and I think I really am one of those people that really could hide in society for a long time. Even here I can almost hide it. But it's something that you don't want to talk about. And when people bring it up, you try to change the subject really quickly because you don't even see yourself as having a disability.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think, you know, as you're saying that, I realize why when I try to talk about it in this way, it comes out more halting. Because it is a subject nobody really wants to discuss. In a way, it's probably the biggest elephant in the room for any group of people with a disability.
I think one of the things that I find interesting and constant in my discussions with people is, I look around and I see that there's people far worse off than I am. Every single person says it. Even a person, you know, who you would think, okay, this person's just about to be in an iron lung, would say, there's plenty of people that are worse off than I am. And I think that that's a really interesting reflection on how people sort of see their capacity as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. It reminds me of, there was an Arlo Guthrie song that he has a very, very long introduction to, and the whole introduction is about the person who is the last person in the chain of, you think you got it bad, look at this guy. He says, well, what about the last person? But I don't think anybody thinks they're the last person.
One more question? No, just stop. Stop right there.
It's virtually impossible to find anybody on Earth without some form of disability. I think in balance to what you're saying, and I always balance things that way, even the most perfect person you can meet, when you really get to know, they've got some little aspect that is disabling them, although they maybe hide it very well.
I think there's truth in that, but I think that's both valuable and that it's both valuable and minimizing to the concept of actual disability, because I think that everybody has things that aren't perfect and things that don't work as well. I mean, obviously I'm wearing glasses, and I'm also up for cataract surgery in a month, which you can't see. But is that a disability? Well, is it the same as what if my arms didn't work? Speaking of what about this guy? You know, what if I was, as they call it, an upside down polio? It's not the same thing. Anybody?
Okay, well, just one more then. If we've got one more question, and then we'll thank Stephanie and have afternoon tea, because I know you're probably all starving to death by now, you know, haven't eaten enough in this session.
Look, I think it was important that you articulated often how we feel so well. And I think the thing is that most of us, and a lot of people I've talked to, we feel we face these things alone. You know, and it's important to embrace that collective idea that, hey, we're in the same boat. These things have happened to us. And often some of us revisit things that we've forgotten from years ago. But I just want to commend you, because I thought you spoke so well and so passionately about things that we feel and we encounter, and things that we're beginning to look at again.
Well, thank you, but I think that all of you have a bigger voice in that than I do, because I don't have polio. I'm a family member, but I don't have polio. But I thank you very much for what you said. That's very lovely.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Stephanie Machell. We've all learnt a lot.